talking about 5 of my favorite short stories, and because this was so hard to narrow down, I decided to only talk about stories that have been published in the New Yorker magazine. I recently just started getting the print version of the magazine, which has been so much fun. I get to read a new short fictional story, plus a lot of other things every week. And I've also started listening to the New Yorker Fiction podcast. This was something new that I discovered this year, and it's honestly changed the game for me. I love hearing stories being read out loud by their authors. That's the New Yorker's Writer's Voice podcast, and their main fiction podcast is authors reading other people's stories out loud that have been published at some point in the New Yorker archives. So I've discovered a lot of new stories that way, which has been super fun. So I just wanted to put that out there in case you guys were interested in checking it out too. So the story that I'm going to be starting with is actually Signs and Symbols by Vladimir Nabokov. I don't know how you say his name. If you know, please comment or tell me. I've heard Nabokov, I've heard Nabokov. I like to say Nabokov because Russian is hard. But this story, Signs and Symbols, was published for the first time in the New Yorker in 1948. And I love this story. It's genuinely one of my all-time favorites. And I had the sweetest subscriber tell me that the story that I wrote last week reminded them of this one, which is hilarious and not true at all. But so sweet of them to comment that, because I always try to emulate Nabokov in his writing. I think he has this beautiful specificity and detail that is pretty much unparalleled. I'm curious if any of you guys have read authors that you think are similar to him. I would love to read them, because I just don't think I've ever come across anyone who comes close to his ability to create these visual tableaus. And they're so original. I don't know if it's the fact that a lot of his work was originally written in English, but he is Russian and he wrote a lot in Russian, and so maybe it's his thoughts coming in Russian and translating those thoughts to English. But it's so original, and he comes up with these ways of describing moments in life that any writer would be envious of. I mean, I just think he is such a genius when it comes to the written word, and I'm a huge fan. So putting that out there, I was already biased to begin with, but when I read this story, I knew it was going to go down as one of my all-time favorites. It has a lot of signs and symbols, as the title would suggest, weaved throughout the story, and we get these little vignettes. We see a broken down subway train, we see a young woman crying on the back of the bus who otherwise has no other part of the story. We see this fledgling young bird twitching and dying in a puddle, and 10 jam jars. There's all these little images and vignettes that we see throughout the story, and we're trying to piece them together. And some critics have argued that Nabokov does this to sort of force the reader to constantly be overreading or trying to decode and decipher the story, in the same way that the son of the 2 main characters in the story has this referential mania in which he feels the need to decode all of these signs that he reads in nature and in natural phenomenon, because he believes there's some grand universal conspiracy being plotted against him, and that somehow by reading those signs he will be able to uncover the conspiracy. Which, although it's horribly sad, it's also so interesting and intriguing an idea. So basically, a quick plot summary. An elderly couple tries to visit their deranged son, or mentally ill son, in a sanatorium on his birthday, and they can't decide what gift to bring him. And it's just this horribly sad meditation on whether he should stay in the mental facility or whether they should pull him out. We know that he is suicidal, and then we get this sort of ambiguous ending. For me, I read this as a tragedy. I do think that there is a death at the end, which makes it all the more beautiful and all the more sad. But let me know what you think if you've read the story, because it is pretty ambiguous and there's been a lot of different interpretations about the ending. So yeah, let me know what you think. There's so many different aspects of the story I could get into. I mean, the couple are immigrants, which I think does play a role in the fabric of the story and the way they are perceived and perceive themselves in society. Nabokov's prose, I just think, is masterful. I'm gonna read a little snippet because I think the writing speaks best for itself. Clouds in the staring sky transmit to each other, by means of slow signs, incredibly detailed information regarding him. His inmost thoughts are discussed at nightfall in manual alphabet by darkly gesticulating trees. Pebbles or stains or sun flecks form patterns representing, in some awful way, messages that he must intercept. Everything is a cipher, and of everything he is the theme. All around him there are spies. Some of them are detached observers, like glass surfaces and still pools. Others, such as coats and store windows, are prejudiced witnesses, lynchers at heart. Others again, running water, storms, are hysterical to the point of insanity, have a distorted opinion of him, and grotesquely misinterpret his actions. He must be always on his guard and devote every minute and module of life to the decoding of the undulation of things. Again, I just think that the way that some of these things are described, like the coat in the store window being a prejudiced witness that grotesquely misinterprets his actions. I mean, it feels like it's at the heart of literature for me. It's turning something in the outside world into prose that describes it almost better than it can even be envisioned in the real world, if that makes sense. I don't know if it does, but for me, I think writing evokes something that lets us understand an image, a moment, a person, an idea in the world better than us just seeing it in the world. It's like verisimilitude. It's so close to reality that it's almost better. So anyway, so many details that are symbols in this story, and I think it's really interesting that Nabokov would implicate the reader in that way by forcing them to decipher and decode these symbols if they want to interpret and better understand the story. I do want to mention that Lori Moore, who is a wonderful New Yorker writer, wrote a story in tribute of this one called Referential that was published in the New Yorker in 2012. I personally prefer the original. I'm kind of the opinion that, at least in the case of this story, I don't know about tributes as a whole, but in the case of this story, I don't know if there's much more to add to the conversation. Her tribute, her story takes place in a more modern setting. There's a slight difference in characters. There's a stepfather figure that there isn't in the original. And though I'm sure it comes out of a place of really loving and respecting the original, I'm just kind of the opinion that, like, why mess with something that's already so perfect? And so I got kind of offended on Nabokov's behalf when Lori Moore wrote this, or when I read this for the first time. But anyway, ignore me. I don't know if I have much else to say other than I love this story, and if you do too, please let me know. My one creative writing teacher told me that she didn't like the story that much, but she really loved Nabokov's The Vane Sisters. It deals with a similar concept in forcing readers to decode the writing itself. I didn't like that one as much. Of course, I think Nabokov's fantastic in all of his stories, but this one, it's so emotionally evocative. I think I cried the first time I read it and got to the ending. It really just sinks into you, and that's all I can say. I love it. Let me know what you think if you've read it. Moving on to the next one. Who Will Greet You at Home by Leslie Neka Arima. It was published in the New Yorker in 2015, so it's pretty recent. This one I was blown away with. I heard it for the first time on the podcast I mentioned, and it's nothing like I've ever really read before. It definitely feels like it's sort of in its own genre. It's almost half fairy tale, a little twist on the Cinderella story, half horror story. I mean, it's definitely terrifying at times. It feels almost surreal in that it takes place in a universe quite similar but also quite different to ours. It's just sort of this alternate reality in which women are the sole creators of life. Men aren't really a part of the story at all, and they aren't factored into the act of reproduction, which is really interesting, and I think definitely The story deeply deals with motherhood and what is expected of mothers. There's one quote in the story that I love. "A mother should give all of herself to her child, even if it requires the marrow in her bones," which I think is so profound. And it does comment on our society today, in which there's this pressure to create the perfect child and for women to sacrifice everything in their own life, the marrow in their bones, literally, for the thriving and the health of their child, which is definitely an interesting concept. And also joy, their joy. In this story, joy becomes a commercial good, I guess you could say, that can be bartered and can be given away. And the main character, Ogechi, has to give away her joy to her landlord and her boss because she has no money. And even that can be something that can be commodified is such a fascinating idea, but especially in the context of motherhood, that you have to give your joy away in order for your child to be happy, is totally fascinating. And yeah, I think there's an element of women judging other women in their motherhood, and we see parallels of that all the time in real life in our own society. There's also this judging of external appearances, and we see very clear elements of class struggle and poverty and how that affects families. I mean, it's very clear to me that the author is dealing with how being raised in wealthy circumstances can provide so many things to a child. I'm gonna read a snippet of it and then talk a little bit more. "Yarn had been a foolish choice, she knew. The stuff for women of leisure, who could cradle wool in the comfort of their own cars and in secure houses devoid of loose nails. Not for an assistant hairdresser who took Danfo to work if she had money, walked if she didn't, and lived in an apartment that amounted to a room she could clear in 3 large steps. Women like her had to form their children out of sturdier, more practical material to withstand the dents and scrapes that came with a life like hers. Her mother had formed her from mud and twigs and wrapped her limbs tightly with leaves, like moin moin, pedestrian items that had produced a pedestrian girl. Ogechi was determined that her child would be a thing of whimsy, soft and pretty and tender and worthy of love." I think that last line says it all. Soft and pretty and tender and worthy of love. That physical beauty should be valued above strength and endurance. That babies should be made of material that's beautiful versus material that's had hardships. I mean, I think mud and twigs, it speaks very clearly of poverty and external circumstances that affect the way a child is raised. So I think this is beautiful. I really want to pick up her short story collection because I believe that she came out with that pretty recently, and her writing is so beautiful in my opinion. So I definitely recommend this one. Okay, moving on. My next story is called Roy Spivey, and it's by Miranda July. It was published in 2007 in the New Yorker, and the quick plot line is that a woman meets a celebrity on a plane and it changes her life. What I love about Miranda July is that she's not just a writer, but she also works in the film world. She's written films and produced and acted and performed in them, which is so cool that she's so multi-talented. She has this very quirky, bizarre energy to her as a person, but also it comes across in her writing in a very likable and humorous way. The whole tone of the story is very wry, very dry and ironic, and it feels like the narrator is confiding something very intimate with us, the reader. I also wanted to say that there is a podcast of this story being read out loud by David Sedaris, and his voice added to this story is hilarious. I feel like this story has all the elements that would facilitate it to be read out loud. It's super funny, it's super quick and entertaining, the writing's simple. So yeah, I definitely recommend listening to that if you get a chance, because I think it pairs perfectly with David Sedaris' sense of humor, and he really liked the story as well. But really, I think what's consequential about this encounter is how brief it is, and yet how much it forces the main characters to sort of reevaluate her life and her purpose. I think it deals a lot with vulnerability and coming to terms with regrets late in life and missed opportunities. And again, like I mentioned, the language is really simple. It's first-person narration, which is realistic and comfortable, and honestly, this story I think is one of the best examples of that I've read, especially in like modern writing. I feel like it does a really good job of letting us get into the mind of the main character. Also, the dialogue is wonderful. There's a lot of it, and it feels very simple and almost mundane at first, like they're not really talking about anything important, but it becomes clear that there's a lot more going on underneath the surface. There's a lot of untapped emotions that sort of come across through that dialogue. It's really masterfully done. There's some weird parts like spraying of Febreze underneath armpits on the plane and biting each other, the main character, and the celebrity. I'll read a little snippet. He slid back his jacket, unbuttoned the first 4 buttons on his shirt, and pulled it back, exposing a large, tanned shoulder. I leaned over and very quickly bit it lightly, and then picked up my Sky Mall catalog and began reading. After a minute, he rebuttoned himself and slowly picked up his copy of Sky Mall. We read like this for a good half hour. During this time, I was careful not to think about my life. My life was far below us, in an orangey pink stucco apartment building. It seemed as though I might never have to return to it now. The salt of his shoulder buzzed on the tip of my tongue. I might never again stand in the middle of the living room and wonder what to do next. I sometimes stood there for up to 2 hours, unable to generate enough momentum to eat, to go out, to sleep, to clean. It seemed unlikely that someone who had just bitten and been bitten by a celebrity would have had this kind of problem. I love that line so much. I think the idea of standing in the middle of your living room and not knowing what to do, not being able to generate the momentum to do anything at all, is wonderfully evocative and realistic, and feels like a universal experience. I feel like I've been that person standing in the middle of the living room. It definitely speaks of fear and being afraid that you can't fulfill your own expectations for yourself in your life. But overall, this is just a very easy, fun story to read. It'll keep you super entertained, I promise. Another Miranda July story that I wanted to mention was The Metal Bowl, which was equally hilarious and weird and interesting, and has her sort of comic tone and timing embedded in it. So if you're interested, check that one out too. My next story is Barn Burning by Murakami, and I figured I would put one Murakami story in here. I'm actually a little behind on the trend of his writing. I haven't read any of his bigger novels yet. I did just purchase the Wind Up Bird Chronicle, so I'm gonna be reading that soon. But I really like this story. This one is based on an original by Faulkner that was published in the 30s. I haven't read the original, so if you have and you liked it, let me know if it's worthy of a read, because Faulkner can be difficult at times, having read The Sound of the Fury. And though that book was worth it, I'm not always sure if I'm there for the investment. But yeah, let me know. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Murakami, but if you're not, his writing is very sparse, very simplistic, yet he is a master of giving moments their room to breathe. There's actually a film adaptation of this story, I believe called Burning, and I read a review of it, and the critic wrote that the style of the film is slow cinema, and not only do I think that's perfect and necessary for an adaptation of this story, but I think that applies to his writing as a whole. I think it is very cinematic. I think it's important to mention that Barn Burning becomes a metaphor for something a lot darker. It's kind of a meditation on evil, the performance of good versus evil, and evil in humanity and human nature, and our culpability, our complacency when others do evil. There's a reference to Adolf Eichmann, who was one of the major organizers of the Holocaust. And the reference seems sort of like out of the blue on a first read, but I think It really has everything to do with this question of evil, and the narrator himself at one point questions whether he should just burn the barn down. And like I said, burning the barn isn't really the act itself, but whether he should do it himself or wait for someone else to do it. And I think it's such an interesting concept that Murakami is dealing with in this story, and I think it's definitely worth reading. My favorite part I will read out loud. As I mentioned, when I first met her, she told me she was studying mime. One night we were out at a bar and she showed me the tangerine peeling. As the name says, it involves peeling a tangerine. On her left was a bowl piled high with tangerines. On her right, a bowl for the peels. At least that was the idea. Actually, there wasn't anything there at all. She'd take an imaginary tangerine in her hand, slowly peel it, put one section in her mouth, and spit out the seeds. When she'd finished one tangerine, she'd wrap up all the seeds in the peel and deposit it in the bowl to her right. She repeated these movements over and over again. When you try to put it in words, it doesn't sound like anything special, but if you see it with your own eyes for 10 or 20 minutes, almost without thinking, she kept on performing it. Gradually, the sense of reality is sucked right out of everything around you. It's a very strange feeling. I just love how the main character is dealing with reality being sucked out of everything around him. Murakami seems to really be dealing with the mundane aspects of life and giving them new meanings and excavating them for interesting tidbits, and just kind of allowing us to really visualize those moments in a very cinematic way in order to better understand the deeper meanings behind them. The last story that I want to talk about is 3 Days by Samantha Hunt. The story is interesting because it does take place in the present tense, which at first I was a little bit surprised by. I thought it was an interesting choice. As somebody who's written and experimented with the present tense, it can be pretty difficult at times to feel realistic and feel necessary, just because I think past tense is such a staple in writing. But in this case, I think it works so well because the author is dealing with sort of this past, present, and future. The characters are looking back and having flashbacks of past memories and past trauma and a lack of agency in their father's death, which happened in the past, how they're dealing with that in the present, along with the present day trauma that is unfolding in front of us, and then how they project that into their futures, how they see themselves moving forward, which honestly, the story kind of ends in a bleak, dismal way, but the writing makes it hopelessly real. And it's so suspenseful, it's funny, it's horrifying, and it's plot driven, but it's also full of characterization, which I think is just great. And her prose is really beautiful. It's fun to read, it's compelling, it's captivating. I have so many good things to say about it. I was really caught off guard with this one. I wasn't really expecting to like it as much as I did, but I keep thinking back to moments in the story that I found really interesting. There's one moment when the brother of the main character gets high and time sort of slows down for him as well as her. Also, the title is a mystery. It's called 3 Days, but the whole story is encapsulated in one evening, so I don't really know what that could mean. I think when I was listening to the podcast about it, the editor of New Yorker and the person who was reading it, David Gilbert, were kind of speculating about where that title came from, whether it came from Easter because there were Easter decorations in the house that are described because that's a 3-day event, or the editor said that the author, Samantha Hunt, got the lyrics from a Willie Nelson song. But I do think that's an interesting title given that the story is really focused on one evening, and I think it says something about what the story is dealing with on a larger scale as a whole. And like I said, I think time, I think memory, the difference between past, present, and future, and the convergence of those things is really central to this piece. I'm gonna read one of my favorite parts. When Atlantis was sinking, there was an awful period of, and Beatrice's mother stops to think of the proper word but can't. Of sinking, she says, and places her open hands on either side of her face. She says, and places her open hands on either side of her face like the sunshine. She says, and places her open hands on either side of her face like the sunshine. Her mother resorts to theatrics when she's nervous. Beatrice cringes at the gesture. She knows that her mother is going to try to tell her something she doesn't want to hear. Imagine, her mother says, her hand still in place. People went to sleep inland and woke up with the ocean right there at their door. And when they stepped outside in the morning to pee or to feed their goats, all the neighbors were gone without a trace, and the only sound was waves lapping. Beatrice's mother still works for mythologic, and now she firmly believes that all concepts are better communicated through specious retellings of ancient myths. Most of the time, Beatrice can't see the connections. So I thought that was a really good example of the mother and daughter dynamic, as well as the introduction of myths and stories being really central in this piece. And I like that this is outlined here in this paragraph, because this idea of sinking definitely comes back later in the story, and I think the author does a great job with echoing, foreshadowing, and bringing back in elements that have come up earlier, which I think is just really awesome. So yeah, I definitely recommend this one, as all the others that I mentioned. If you've read any of these already and you really like them or didn't like them, please let me know in the comments down below. I'm super curious to hear what you guys think, or if you know any more about these authors, I'd love to get your opinions and your thoughts. As always, if you liked this video or if you'd like to see more content like this, then please consider subscribing. It would mean a ton to me. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate you being here. Have a good rest of your day, evening, night, morning. Happy reading.